I never thought a stupid college party would change everything. But when Andy stood in front of me and laughed at my dance moves, that loud, cruel kind of laughter that cuts through a crowded room, I felt like someone had ripped my heart out and held it up for everyone to see. Dude, Elliot, what are you doing? Is that dancing or are you having a stroke? His voice pierced through the bass-heavy music and the chatter of drunk students, and several people turned to look at me, snickering. My face burned with such intense embarrassment that I thought I might actually combust right there on the makeshift dance floor. I froze completely, my body refusing to cooperate, refusing to move even an inch. Dancing had always been something I loved, something private and personal that I did alone in my bedroom when no one was watching. Just me and my music and the freedom to move however I wanted. But I'd never taken a single lesson, never learned proper technique or form. And now, in this painful, humiliating moment, I was just another loser being mocked in front of a room full of people who would probably remember this for weeks. I looked down at my phone, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white, and seriously considered just walking out. I could leave right now, disappear into the night, let the embarrassment fade with time and distance. My legs were already preparing to carry me toward the exit, when something completely unexpected happened. A hand landed on my waist, gentle but confident, warm and reassuring in a way that made my breath catch. Relax, a voice said close to my ear, deep and smooth like honey. Let me show you. I turned slowly, my heart suddenly racing for an entirely different reason than embarrassment. And there he was, Mac, Andy's cousin. The guy was tall with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead, and these intense gray eyes that seemed to see right through me. Everyone on campus knew about him. He was a professional dancer, a choreographer who'd performed in actual shows, someone who seemed completely untouchable and way out of my league. My heart skipped several beats as he looked at me with those piercing eyes. His fingers were still resting on my waist, applying just enough pressure to guide me, to ground me in that moment of chaos. You can do this, he said without smiling. But his eyes held something I couldn't quite name, maybe belief, or perhaps a challenge, daring me to prove Andy wrong. The music started again, the bass vibrating through the wooden floor and up through my bones. This time I moved with Mac's guidance, his hand on my waist steering me through the rhythm with subtle shifts and gentle pressure. For the first time in my entire life I felt like I was actually dancing, not just flailing around hoping for the best. My body responded to his touch, to the way he heaved me through each beat, each measure of the song. The room seemed to fade away until it was just us, moving together in perfect sync. When the song ended and people started clapping, actually clapping for us, I caught sight of Andy's face in the crowd. He looked furious, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles working. His eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. Max slowly released my waist, but his gaze stayed locked on me, studying my face like he was trying to memorize something important. And in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning of something much bigger and infinitely more complicated than I could have imagined. The party continued around us, but I felt disconnected from it all, still processing what had just happened. People were talking, laughing, dancing, but all I could think about was the weight of Mac's hand on my waist, the way he'd looked at me like I actually mattered, like I was worth his time and attention. Andy had disappeared into the crowd, probably too angry to stick around, and I honestly couldn't blame him. If I'd just mocked someone and then watched my own cousin swoop in to make them look good, I'd probably need some space too. But I couldn't focus on Andy's feelings right now. Not when my own were such a tangled mess of confusion, excitement, and something else I didn't want to name yet. Mac moved away from the dance floor, heading toward the kitchen area where drinks were set up on a long table. I watched him go, not sure if I should follow or just leave before things got even more awkward. But then he glanced back over his shoulder, making direct eye contact with me, and gave a small nod toward the exit. Was that an invitation? A dismissal? I had no idea, but my feet were moving before my brain could catch up, following him as he navigated through the crowd of people. We ended up outside on the front porch where the air was cooler and the music was muffled enough that we could actually hear ourselves think. He leaned against the railing, looking out at the dark street, and I stood there awkwardly, waiting for him to say something, anything. "You've got natural rhythm," he finally said, still not looking at me. "It's buried under a lot of hesitation and self-doubt, but it's there." I didn't know how to respond to that. Was it a compliment? An observation? Thanks. I managed, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. He turned to face me then, those gray eyes intense in the dim porch light. Have you ever thought about actually learning? Taking real lessons instead of just messing around? The question caught me off guard. I don't know. I never really considered it seriously. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. Well, maybe you should. You might surprise yourself with what you're capable of. There was something in the way he said it, something that felt like more than just encouragement about dancing. Before I could ask what he meant, voices erupted from inside the house. Andy's voice. Loud and angry, though I couldn't make out the words. Mac's expression shifted, became guarded and closed off. I should go deal with that, he said, pushing off from the railing. But think about what I said, Elliot. He knew my name. I hadn't told him my name, which meant he'd either heard Andy say it or had known who I was before tonight. That realization sent a strange thrill through me as I watched him disappear back into the party, leaving me alone on the porch with a head full of questions and a heart that wouldn't stop racing. The next morning, campus felt surreal, like I'd stepped into an alternate version of my normal life. Everything looked the same. The brick buildings, the sprawling green lawns, the clusters of students walking between classes. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I couldn't stop thinking about last night, about Mac's hand on my waist and the way he'd made me feel capable of something I'd always thought was beyond my reach. After my last class of the day, I headed to my locker to grab some books I'd need for homework. I was so lost in thought, mechanically arranging textbooks and notebooks in my backpack, that I didn't notice Mac until he spoke. You looked good last night, he said casually, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. He was leaning against the locker next to mine, arms crossed over his chest, looking completely at ease while I felt like my entire nervous system was short-circuiting. My fingers fumbled with the book I was holding, and it slipped from my grasp, hitting the floor with a loud thud that made several people in the hallway turn to look. Oh, thank you? My voice came out higher than normal, embarrassingly shaky. A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The first real smile I'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face from intimidating to almost approachable. I'm being serious about what I said last night, he continued, his tone shifting to something more businesslike. Would you be interested in real dance lessons? Proper training, not just party floor improvisation. My brain went completely blank for several seconds. Was he actually offering to teach me? Why would you want to do that? I asked carefully, trying to understand his motivation. He couldn't possibly get anything out of teaching someone as inexperienced as me. His expression became more serious, thoughtful. Because you have genuine potential, Elliot. Raw talent that could be developed into something impressive. And I don't waste my time on people who don't have that spark. Before I could formulate any kind of response to that statement, Andy appeared at the end of the hallway. I could tell he'd spotted us because his entire body language changed. His casual walk became purposeful, almost aggressive, as he strode toward us with clear intent. Mac, what's going on here? His voice was tight, controlled but barely, with an undercurrent of accusation and jealousy that made the air feel heavy. Nothing dramatic, Mac replied smoothly, seemingly unbothered by Andy's obvious tension. Just inviting Elliot to my studio for some dance classes. Andy looked at me like I'd personally betrayed him, like my mere existence was somehow an offense. Him? You want to teach him to dance? Are you actually serious right now, or is this some kind of joke? The way he said it stung more than his laughter had last night. Completely serious, Mac said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. He's got more natural ability than you seem to think. Andy's face flushed red, a visible wave of frustration and anger coloring his features. He grabbed Mac's arm, his grip tight enough that I could see his knuckles turning white. We need to talk. Privately. Right now. He practically dragged Mac down the hallway toward the exit, and I was left standing there alone, my backpack half packed, trying to process what had just happened. The confrontation had drawn attention from other students, and I could feel their curious stares, probably wondering what kind of drama they'd just witnessed. I quickly finished gathering my things and headed out of the building, taking a different exit to avoid running into Mac and Andy again. I was halfway across the parking lot when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number. I opened the message with trembling fingers, somehow knowing it would be from him before I even read it. Tomorrow, 6 p.m. Studio address, 2847 Riverside Drive, Unit 3B. Don't be late. My heart started hammering in my chest. That familiar racing feeling I'd been experiencing ever since Mac had first touched my waist last night. This was real. This was actually happening. He wanted to teach me, to spend time with me, to see if I really did have the potential he seemed to think I possessed. I saved the address immediately, already planning my route, figuring out which bus I'd need to take to get there on time. Part of me wondered if I should be more cautious, more questioning of his motives, but a larger part was just thrilled at the opportunity. For the first time in my life, someone who actually knew what they were talking about thought I could be good at something, thought I was worth investing time in. The rest of the day passed in a blur of distraction. I went through the motions in my remaining classes, but I couldn't have told you a single thing any of my professors said. My mind was too busy imagining what the studio would look like, what kind of training Mac would put me through, whether I'd embarrass myself or actually manage to prove him right about my potential. That night I barely slept, tossing and turning as my brain refused to shut off, running through scenarios and possibilities until my alarm went off the next morning. The following day dragged on forever. Each class felt like it lasted twice as long as usual, every minute crawling by with agonizing slowness. I watched the clock obsessively, counting down the hours and then the minutes until 6 p.m. When my last class finally ended at 4:30, I had over an hour to kill before I needed to leave for the studio. I went back to my apartment, changed into comfortable clothes that seemed appropriate for dancing, athletic shorts and a fitted t-shirt, and stared at myself in the mirror. Who was I becoming? 24 hours ago, I was just Elliot, the guy who liked to dance alone in his room. Now I was Elliot, the guy who'd somehow caught the attention of the most talented dancer on campus, the guy who was about to walk into a professional studio for his first real lesson. The transformation felt impossible and inevitable at the same time, like my life had been leading to this moment all along and I just hadn't realized it until now. The studio was located in a converted warehouse district on the edge of downtown, surrounded by art galleries and small creative businesses that gave the area an eclectic bohemian atmosphere. I stood outside Unit 3B for a full minute, gathering my courage before pushing open the heavy door. The space inside was smaller than I'd imagined but incredibly professional. Floor-to-ceiling mirrors covered one entire wall, reflecting the polished wooden floor that gleamed under strategically placed warm lighting. The other walls were painted a deep charcoal gray, and minimal furniture, just a small bench and a sound system, kept the space open and focused on movement. Mac was already there, dressed in a fitted black tank top that showed off his muscular arms and dark gray joggers. He was in the middle of stretching, one leg extended in a perfect split that made my own muscles ache just watching him. When I walked in, he glanced up and assessed me with those intense gray eyes. "You're early," he observed, checking his watch. "I appreciate punctuality." I'd arrived 10 minutes before 6, too nervous to risk being late. "I didn't want to keep you waiting," I admitted, setting my bag down near the bench. He straightened from his stretch with fluid grace and walked over to the sound system, scrolling through what looked like an extensive playlist. "Before we start with actual choreography, we need to work on fundamentals," he explained, selecting a track with a slow, sensual beat that filled the studio. "Your biggest problem right now is tension. You're fighting your own body instead of working with it." I nodded, trying to focus on his words instead of the way his voice seemed to resonate through the space. "How do I fix that?" He moved closer, stopping just inches away from me. "First, you need to understand how your body moves naturally. Stop thinking so much and start feeling." His hand landed on my shoulder, warm and solid, and I tried not to visibly react to the contact. "Drop your shoulders. You're holding all your stress right here." I attempted to relax, but it was difficult when I was hyper-aware of every point where his fingers touched my shirt. "Breathing," he continued, his voice taking on an instructional quality. "Deep breaths from your diaphragm, not shallow ones from your chest. It affects everything, your balance, your movement, your ability to sustain motion." I focused on my breathing, trying to make it slower and deeper, more controlled. "Better," he said after a moment. "Now we're going to work on basic body isolation. He moved behind me, and suddenly I could feel the warmth radiating from him even though he wasn't quite touching me. I'm going to guide your hips through some movements. Don't overthink it, just follow my lead. His hands settled on my waist, fingers spanning my hip bones, and every nerve ending in my body seemed to light up simultaneously. Move with me, he instructed softly, close enough that I could feel his breath against my ear. Left, then right. Feel how the weight shifts from one side to the other. He guided my hips through the movement, slow and controlled, his hands firm but not forceful. The motion felt awkward at first, too deliberate and conscious, but as we repeated it several times, something began to shift. I started to feel the rhythm in my bones, the natural sway that my body wanted to follow. Don't watch your feet, he said when I glanced down. Eyes on the mirror. Watch how your whole body moves, not just the parts you're consciously controlling. I lifted my gaze to our reflection and the image stopped me cold. We looked like we belonged together, his taller frame behind mine, his hands on my waist, our bodies moving in perfect synchronization. There was an intimacy to it that had nothing to do with dancing and everything to do with the way he was looking at me in the mirror, his expression focused and intense. You're getting it, he said, and I could hear approval in his voice. Your body knows what to do when you stop fighting it. We continued for what felt like both minutes and hours, time losing all meaning as I fell into the rhythm. He showed me how to isolate my shoulders, how to move my chest independently from my hips, how to make fluid transitions between movements instead of jerky, disconnected steps. Every instruction came with a touch, his hands correcting my posture, adjusting my alignment, demonstrating proper form, and with every touch I became more aware of him, more conscious of the growing tension between us that had nothing to do with dance technique and everything to do with the way my heart raced when he was close. When he finally stepped back and turned off the music, I felt oddly bereft, missing the contact immediately. That's enough for today, he said, grabbing 2 water bottles from a small refrigerator I hadn't noticed before and tossing one to me. You did well for a first session. I caught the bottle awkwardly, still trying to process everything that had just happened. Thank you for doing this, I said, meaning it, for giving me a chance. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Same time tomorrow. We'll build on what you learned today. I nodded, not trusting my voice. As I gathered my things to leave, he spoke again. Elliot. I turned back to face him. The reason I'm doing this. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I want you to prove Andy wrong. He dismissed you without giving you any real chance, and I think you deserve better than that. There was something in his voice, something deeper that suggested this was about more than just defending me against his cousin's casual cruelty. But before I could ask what he meant, he turned back to the sound system, effectively ending the conversation. I left the studio with more questions than answers, my body pleasantly tired from the unexpected workback and my mind racing with possibilities. What was really happening here? Was this actually just about dance, about proving I had potential, or was there something else beneath the surface, something neither of us was ready to acknowledge yet? The walk back to the bus stop felt different than the journey here. I'd arrived nervous and uncertain, but I was leaving with a strange sense of anticipation, like I'd just taken the first step on a path that would lead somewhere I couldn't yet see but desperately wanted to discover. The following week transformed my entire college experience in ways I hadn't anticipated. Andy stopped acknowledging my existence completely when we passed each other on campus. He'd look right through me like I was invisible, or worse, like I was something unpleasant he wanted to avoid. His eyes held this burning resentment whenever they accidentally met mine, a mixture of anger and something that looked uncomfortably like betrayal. It felt strange because I hadn't actually done anything wrong. I was just learning to dance, just accepting help that had been offered to me. But clearly in Andy's mind I'd committed some unforgivable offense by getting close to Mac. The sessions at the studio had become a fixed point in my daily routine now, something I looked forward to with an intensity that probably wasn't healthy. Every day at exactly 6 in the evening I'd push through those heavy doors and enter a world where nothing existed except movement and music and Mac's careful instruction. What I'd started to notice though was how the dynamic between us had been gradually shifting. The touches that had initially been purely instructional, his hands correcting my posture, adjusting my stance, now lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. When he demonstrated a movement and I had to mirror it, the space between our bodies seemed to shrink incrementally with each passing session. But even as the physical distance decreased, Mac maintained this emotional barrier that I couldn't quite penetrate. He was warm and encouraging during our lessons, but the moment we finished, he'd retreat behind this wall of professional detachment that left me feeling confused and uncertain about what was actually happening between us. On Thursday evening, we were working on a particularly complex sequence that required close partnering. The choreography demanded that we move in perfect synchronization, our bodies aligned and coordinated in ways that felt almost uncomfortably intimate. Mac had positioned himself behind me, his chest nearly touching my back, one hand on my hip and the other guiding my arm through a sweeping motion. The music was playing, a slow instrumental piece with a haunting melody, and we'd been repeating the same 8 count for nearly 20 minutes, trying to get it exactly right. Then, warning, Mac reached over and stopped the music. The sudden silence felt jarring, almost oppressive. I could hear both our breathing, slightly elevated from the exertion, and nothing else. "Can I ask you something personal?" His voice came from right behind me, low and unexpectedly vulnerable. My heart rate, which had just started to normalize, immediately accelerated again. "Sure," I managed, though my throat felt tight. "Do you ever feel a connection with someone that goes beyond just the physical interaction?" He asked it carefully, like he was testing dangerous waters. "When you're dancing with another person, when you're moving together and everything just clicks, do you feel something deeper than technique?" I swallowed hard, acutely aware of how close he still was, how I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "What do you mean exactly?" I stalled, needing clarification even though part of me understood precisely what he was asking. "I mean the kind of connection where you're aware of every breath they take, every subtle shift in their weight," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Where you can anticipate their next move before they make it, not because you've rehearsed it but because you're somehow tuned into them on a level that transcends the steps." I stood very still, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile moment of honesty. "Yes," I finally admitted, barely above a whisper. "I know exactly what you're talking about." I felt him shift behind me, moving even closer if that was possible. "With me?" he asked, and there was something almost desperate in those two words, like my answer mattered more than he wanted it to. "With you?" I confirmed, my voice shaking slightly. The confession hung in the air between us, changing everything and nothing simultaneously. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then Max slowly turned me around to face him, his hands gentle but deliberate on my shoulders. His gray eyes searched mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "I you to know something," he said quietly. "This thing between us, I'm feeling it too. Every single session it gets harder to maintain professional boundaries, because all I want to do is—" He trailed off, his gaze dropping to my lips for just a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. "All I want is to stop pretending this is just about dance." My breath caught in my throat. "Mac," I started to say, but I never got to finish the sentence. The studio door slammed open with enough force to make us both jump apart. Andy stood in the doorway, his face flushed red with rage, his chest heaving like he'd been running. "I knew it," he shouted, his voice echoing off the mirrors and wooden floors. "I've been watching, waiting, and I knew something was going on between you two." Mac's entire demeanor changed instantly, his body language shifting from vulnerable and open to defensive and controlled. "Andy, you need to calm down," he began, but his cousin cut him off viciously. "Don't tell me to calm down." Andy took several aggressive steps into the studio, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You're doing exactly what you always do, Mac. You see something I want, something I care about, and you can't help yourself. You have to take it away from me." I stood frozen, completely blindsided by this outburst. Something he wanted? Something he cared about? Andy had mocked me mercilessly at that party, had made me feel small and worthless. How could he possibly claim to care about me? "You're being ridiculous," Max said coldly. All traces of the warmth he'd shown me moments ago completely vanished. "This has nothing to do with you." "Nothing to do with me?" Andy's voice cracked with emotion. "I saw him first. I noticed him weeks before that party, before you ever paid attention. But I didn't know how to approach him, so I made a stupid joke to get his attention, and you swooped in like some hero to rescue him from my supposed cruelty. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Andy had noticed me before? His mockery had been some twisted attempt at getting my attention. You pushed him away with your words, Max said, his voice hard as steel. That's not my fault. If you'd approached him with kindness instead of cruelty, maybe things would be different. But you didn't. And I'm not going to apologize for being there when he needed someone. Andy's expression crumpled, anger giving way to genuine hurt. Tears welled up in his eyes, though he tried desperately to blink them back. You take everything from me, he said, his voice breaking. Every single thing that matters. You always have, ever since we were kids. The dance scholarships, the competition dins, the opportunities, and now him too. The raw pain in his voice made my chest ache with unexpected sympathy, even though I was still reeling from everything that had just been revealed. Mac didn't respond, didn't defend himself against the accusations. He just stood there with this unreadable expression on his face, watching his cousin fall apart. The silence stretched between the three of us, heavy and uncomfortable until finally Mac spoke. We'll talk about this later, he said quietly, addressing me rather than Andy. You should go home. It wasn't a suggestion, it was clearly a dismissal. I grabbed my bag quickly, desperate to escape the suffocating tension in the room, and practically ran out of the studio. Behind me I could hear Andy's voice rising again, though I couldn't make out the words. My hands were shaking as I waited for the bus, my mind racing through everything that had just happened. Mac had been about to confess something real, something important, before Andy interrupted. And Andy's revelation about noticing me first, about his mockery being some messed up attempt at connection, it reframed that entire humiliating party moment in a completely different light. But what haunted me most was the look on Mac's face when Andy accused him of always taking things away. He hadn't denied it. He just stood there, silent and cold, like he couldn't argue with the truth. What did that mean for us? For whatever this was between us. I spent the entire bus ride home with these questions circling endlessly through my mind. And by the time I walked through my apartment door, I was no closer to having any answers. I avoided the studio for 2 days after the confrontation. Mac texted me multiple times, brief messages asking if I was okay, saying we needed to talk, wondering when I'd be back for our sessions. I ignored every single one, unable to face the complicated mess of emotions churning inside me. My phone rang with his calls at least a dozen times, and each time I let it go to voicemail, not ready to hear his voice or deal with the conversation we inevitably needed to have. Part of me was angry at him for dismissing me so abruptly during the confrontation with Andy, like I was just a problem to be managed rather than a person caught in the middle of their family drama. But a larger part of me was simply confused and overwhelmed, trying to sort through my own feelings while simultaneously processing Andy's shocking revelations and Mac's non-denial of his cousin's accusations. On the third evening, I was attempting to distract myself with homework when there was a knock at my apartment door. Not the buzzer from downstairs, an actual knock, which meant whoever it was had either been let in by another resident or had waited for someone to exit and slipped inside. I already knew who it would be before I looked through the peephole. Mac stood in the hallway looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His usual put-together appearance was disheveled, hair uncombed, dark circles prominent under his eyes, wearing wrinkled clothes that suggested he'd slept in them or maybe hadn't slept at all. "Elliot, please," he said through the door, somehow knowing I was standing right there. "I just need 5 minutes. If you want me to leave after that, I will." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. We stood there staring at each other for a long moment, and I saw him take in my own appearance, the baggy sweatpants, the old t-shirt, the evidence that I hadn't been doing much better than him these past few days. "Why are you here?" I asked, keeping my voice deliberately flat and emotionless. "Because I've been going insane without you," he said bluntly. No artifice or careful phrasing. "Because every hour you don't respond feels like torture and I can't focus on anything except the fact that I messed this up." The raw honesty in his voice made my carefully constructed walls crack slightly. "What Andy said during the fight," I began tentatively, needing to address the elephant neither of us wanted to acknowledge. "About you always ailing things from him." You didn't deny it. Mac ran his hand through his already messy hair, making it worse. The history between Andy and me is complicated, he admitted, leaning against my doorframe like he needed the support. We've been competing since we were children, dance competitions, academic achievements, everything became a contest between us. And yeah, I usually won, but that wasn't because I was trying to take things away from him. It was because I worked harder, trained longer, wanted it more. He paused, his gray eyes meeting mine with painful intensity. But this situation with you, that's completely different. This isn't about Andy at all. Then what is it about? I challenged, needing him to be explicit, to stop dancing around the truth with careful words and ambiguous statements. Tell me straight, am I just another prize in your ongoing competition with your cousin? Am I something you pursued because he showed interest first? No, Max said immediately, forcefully. God, no. Elliot, what I feel for you has absolutely nothing to do with Andy's feelings or his claims or any of our past rivalry. He took a step closer and I didn't move away. When I saw you at that party, struggling with the dancing and being humiliated by his cruel words, my first instinct wasn't to compete with him. It was to help you, to show you that you weren't the disaster he was making you out to be. Everything that's happened since then, the lessons, the time together, the way I can't stop thinking about you, none of that is strategic or calculated or part of some game. His voice dropped lower, more intimate. I have genuine feelings for you, romantic feelings that terrify me because I haven't felt this way about anyone in longer than I can remember. My heart hammered against my ribs, his words doing dangerous things to my carefully maintained emotional distance. What kind of feelings? I pressed, needing absolute clarity, tired of implications and suggestions and moments that could be interpreted multiple ways. Mac took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I have strong feelings for you, Elliot. The kind where I look forward to our sessions not because I enjoy teaching but because it means I get to spend time with you. The kind where I find myself thinking about you at random moments throughout the day, wondering what you're doing, whether you're thinking about me too, replaying conversations we've had. He moved closer still, now standing just inside my apartment threshold. The kind where touching you during our lessons has become both the best and most frustrating part of my day, because I want to touch you for reasons that have nothing to do with dance instruction. Tears pricked unexpectedly at my eyes, the emotional weight of his confession overwhelming my defenses. Mac, I started, but didn't know how to finish. He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to, and cupped my face gently with both hands. His palms were warm against my cheeks, his touch achingly tender. I would never intentionally hurt you, he said softly. What happened the other night, me telling you to leave, that was me trying to protect you from the ugliness of my argument with Andy. It wasn't me pushing you away or treating you like you didn't matter. You matter more than anything. Then he kissed me. It wasn't rushed or desperate or driven by heat. It was slow and careful and achingly sweet, like he was trying to communicate everything he felt through that single point of contact. His lips moved against mine with a gentleness that made my knees weak, and I found myself leaning into him, my hands coming up to grip his shirt for stability. The kiss lasted both forever and not nearly long enough. And when we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. Stay with me, I whispered, the words escaping before I could think better of them. Not for anything physical, just stay. I don't want to be alone tonight. Mac nodded, his forehead resting against mine. Okay, he agreed quietly. Whatever you need. We moved further into my apartment, and he helped me finish the homework I'd been neglecting while we talked. Really talked about everything. His childhood rivalry with Andy, his passion for dance, his fears about getting involved with someone while navigating such complicated family dynamic. I told him about my own insecurities, my surprise at discovering I had talent for something I'd only ever done privately, my confusion about where I fit into the tangled relationship between him and his cousin. As the hours passed and the conversation flowed, I felt the last of my resistance crumbling. Whatever this was between us, complicated and messy and potentially disastrous, it was also real and powerful and unlike anything I'd experienced before. When we finally settled onto my couch, exhausted from emotional honesty, Mac pulled me against his side. I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath my ear. We're going to face problems. I said quietly into the comfortable silence. Andy isn't going to accept this easily. People might judge us, might think I'm using you, or you're manipulating me. I know, Mac acknowledged, his arm tightening around me. But I'm willing to deal with all of that if you are. We'll figure it out together. And somehow, wrapped in his warmth and certainty, I believed him. We'd face whatever came next as a team. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. 3 weeks later, the college announced its annual spring showcase, a prestigious performance event that drew audiences from across the city and often featured scouts from professional dance companies. The moment I heard about it, I knew Mac would want us to participate. What I didn't expect was for him to ask me to be his partner for the main performance slot, the most visible and important position in the entire show. Are you serious? I'd asked when he proposed it during one of our sessions. There are actual trained dancers in the program who would kill for that opportunity. I've only been doing this for a few weeks. He'd smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Trust me on this, Elliot. You're ready. More than ready. So I'd agreed, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. The news spread across campus quickly. Mac choosing the newcomer over experienced dancers caused quite a stir. I heard the whispers in hallways, saw the judgmental looks from people who thought I was sleeping my way into opportunities I hadn't earned. Some of the rumors were cruel, suggesting I was using Mac for fame and advancement. Others were pitying, painting me as naive and being taken advantage of by someone more experienced. Andy's reaction was the worst, though. He started actively spreading stories about me, telling anyone who would listen that I was manipulating Mac, that our relationship was shallow and based on nothing real. He claimed I was a social climber using his cousin's reputation to elevate my own status, that Mac would eventually realize his mistake and drop me. A few people believed him enough that I started getting hostile looks from strangers and cold shoulders from acquaintances who'd previously been friendly. It hurt more than I'd expected, this sudden social isolation based on lies and assumptions. But Mac refused to let me hide from it. One afternoon in the crowded cafeteria, when I was trying to keep my head down and avoid attention, he walked straight up to my table and took my hand in front of everyone. The entire room seemed to pause, conversations dying as people turned to watch. Ignore what they say, he told me clearly, loud enough that nearby tables could definitely hear. The people who matter know the truth. Everyone else is irrelevant. He pulled me to my feet and kissed me right there, in front of dozens of witnesses, making a public statement that was impossible to misinterpret. After that, the whispers changed tone. Some became more supportive, others more vicious, but at least everyone knew where we stood. The weeks leading up to the showcase were intense. We practiced constantly, refining every movement until the choreography was embedded in my muscle memory. Mac pushed me harder than he ever had before, demanding perfection not because he doubted my abilities, but because he knew what I was capable of achieving. There were moments of frustration when I couldn't nail a particularly difficult sequence, moments where I wanted to quit because the pressure felt overwhelming. But Mac was always there, patient and encouraging, breaking down complex movements into manageable pieces and building my confidence step by step. We also grew closer emotionally during those weeks. The time spent together, sweating through rehearsals, grabbing late-night food after practice, falling asleep on his couch while watching dance videos, cemented something between us that went far beyond initial attraction. I learned his quirks and habits, discovered that he was ticklish on his ribs, that he had a weakness for terrible action movies, that he got quiet and withdrawn when he was stressed but would open up if I just sat with him in silence. He learned that I needed verbal reassurance more than I wanted to admit, that I processed emotions through talking, that physical touch grounded me when anxiety threatened to overwhelm my thoughts. The night before the showcase, I barely slept. My mind kept running through the choreography, imagining all the ways I could mess up in front of hundreds of people. When my alarm went off the next morning, I felt exhausted and terrified in equal measure. Mac picked me up early, taking me to get breakfast even though I insisted I was too nervous to eat. "You need fuel," he said firmly, watching me push food around my plate. "Your body can't perform on anxiety alone." I managed to eat half a bagel and some fruit, my stomach too tight with nerves to handle anything more substantial. The hours before the performance crawled by with agonizing slowness. We did a final run-through in the afternoon, and I made several mistakes that I never usually made, which only increased my panic. By the time we arrived backstage that evening, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie my shoes. Mac found me in the dressing area, sitting with my head between my knees, trying to control my breathing. He knelt in front of me, taking my trembling hands in his steady ones. "Look at me," he said gently. When I raised my eyes to meet his, I saw complete confidence reflected there. "You've got this. I wouldn't have chosen you as my partner if I had any doubts about your ability to pull this off." "What if I freeze out there?" I whispered, voicing my deepest fear. "What if my mind goes blank and I forget everything?" "Then you follow my lead," he said simply. "Watch me, feel the music, and let your body remember what your mind might forget. We've practiced this so many times that it's part of you now. Trust yourself, Elliot. But more importantly, trust us. Trust what we've built together." His words steadied me somewhat, enough that I could breathe normally again. We waited in the wings as other performances went before us. And then suddenly it was our turn. The stage lights were blindingly bright as we walked out to our starting positions. I could see the packed auditorium, hundreds of faces watching us, and my heart pounded so hard I thought everyone must be able to hear it. Then the music started, the hauntingly beautiful piece we'd chosen together, and everything else faded away. There was only Mac, only the choreography, only the movement we'd rehearsed until it became second nature. We moved together with the kind of synchronization that can't be faked or forced. Every transition smooth, every lift secure, every moment of contact charged with the genuine connection between us. I was dimly aware of the audience's reaction, the initial murmurs giving way to focused silence as people became absorbed in our performance. But mostly I was aware of Mac, of the way his hands guided me through complex sequences, of how our breathing synchronized, of the trust implicit in every movement we made together. The final pose had us pressed close, his forehead against mine, both of us breathing hard from exertion, his arms wrapped around my waist. For a heartbeat there was complete silence. Then the auditorium erupted. People leaped to their feet, applause thundering through the space, some people actually cheering. I looked out into the crowd, still somewhat dazed, and spotted Andy in the third row. His face was wet with tears, though whether they were from anger or sadness or something else entirely, I couldn't tell. He wasn't clapping, he just stood there for a moment staring at us, then turned and left, disappearing into the crowd heading for the exits. Later, in the small green room backstage after we'd changed out of our performance clothes, Mac pulled me into a tight embrace. "I'm proud of you," he murmured against my hair. "Not just because the performance was flawless, but because you faced your fears and didn't let them control you. That takes real courage." I held him tightly, feeling tears prick at my eyes for entirely different reasons than before. "Thank you," I whispered, "for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. For pushing me past my limits. For everything." He pulled back enough to look at me, his gray eyes soft with affection. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Whatever challenges come next, and there will be challenges, we face them together. No matter what anyone else thinks or says, what we have is real and worth fighting for." I nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging my throat. For the first time in my entire life I felt like I truly belonged somewhere, not just in the dance world that had opened up to me, but specifically in Mac's arms, in his life. In this complicated but beautiful thing we were building together. The path forward wouldn't be easy. Andy's pain was real and wouldn't magically disappear. People would continue to judge and whisper and make assumptions. But standing there with Mac, still high on adrenaline from our successful performance, I felt ready to face whatever came next. This was my story now, my choice, my life to live on my own terms. And I was finally ready to own it completely.